Morning, morning, morning. Good morning. Good morning to you.
Nothing can keep us apart, Joan Underwood. Nothing will keep us apart at all. It could try, but it won't succeed, right, Joan?
Not at all. Get
At
thee
all.
behind us, Satan.
That is right. Well said, well put indeed. As you know, Joan Underwood is the president of HRMAB, and we're talking HR right now. With her right there on your screen too is Kristin Turton, who is an attorney at law and an employer's counsel as well. Good morning to you, Kristin.
Good morning.
Season's greetings, by the way. We haven't had a chance to say that to you yet. Hope you have a wonderful holiday.
Thank you. I wish you the same.
You're welcome. Thank you, too. Joan, we're looking today at maximizing performance in a flexible work environment. And I said to you, while you were not hearing me, I suppose, that COVID-19 has thrown a lot of our businesses in a tailspin. It's caused us to really pivot how we do what we do. And part of that pivoting is looking at flexible work environments. But it also put us in a space where we've had to look at how we measure performance. So where do we start in discussing this subject?
All right, well, let's establish the baseline, the pre-COVID baseline. Supervisors and managers are assigned a team and they're responsible for achieving certain outcomes. They have certain goals, targets, objectives. Now, the functions of management are to plan, lead, organize, and control. Pre-COVID, there were certain things that we took for granted. So, for example, that the people that we were leading, they were in our line of sight. They were with us in a work environment so that we could interact directly with them. One of our responsibilities as we lead our team, as we coordinate the work, is to provide a safe working environment. And again, we had a physical space that we provided for members of our team. That was pre-pandemic. And the pandemic changed all that. And we'll hear more about that from Kristin. Something else that we knew was our responsibility as we managed the performance of the folks assigned to us is that we were responsible for driving morale and for ensuring that they were engaged. And typically we would do that as part of a physical interaction with them. Once the pandemic hit, we no longer had that physical interaction. So we had to change the way we went about doing it. And of course, the most important thing, some would argue, is that we were responsible for the productivity of our team. So we would assign a package of work. We expected them to complete that within a given place and within a given time frame. So we had a 9 to 5 or whatever shift system we had. And so there was a certain amount of output that was expected from our people within that time frame. Then the pandemic hits, people are working from home, they're working different hours, not necessarily the same time frame, the same shifts that we had before. So clearly, with those significant changes in the external environment, the way we manage, the way we planned, lead, organize, and control, that too had to change.
And as a consequence, Kristin, then we found ourselves having to deal with the crisis of the pandemic. But we also had to find ourselves dealing with the crisis of how do we employ people, how do we keep people engaged, and how do we manage those contracts and expectations. And then there was the relaxation of the protocols, and then businesses began to reopen again, and we went back into some bad behavior, so to speak. Let's talk about that, the crisis response and planning for progress and future. How do we tackle this?
I think what would have happened during the pandemic, in the initial stages, especially with lockdowns, is that employers had to pivot, they had to think, they had to adapt very quickly, sometimes in the space of a few days, just to make sure that their businesses could function. And because of that, they didn't have time to consider or implement all of the things that they otherwise would have had to implement. So questions of health and safety at work, questions of data protection. When you've been given 3 days to move your operations from your normal location to all of your employees working remotely, you don't have time to make sure that all of the aspects of health and safety and even, as I said, data protection are in place. Now, what has happened is that employers and employees have come to realize that there's some benefits to that level of flexibility, whether that's in the form of a fully remote environment or a hybrid environment where they're working in the office some days and other days working from a remote location. Um, Employers have realized that that could be of benefit. There might be productivity benefits. Employees like the flexibility and the ability to choose. And because of that, they now have the opportunity to plan so that all of the obligations are now in square view for them. They now have to decide, how am I going to make sure that my employee who's working remotely is operating in a safe environment? How am I going to make sure that there isn't any virtual harassment? And how am I going to make sure ultimately that I can implement and satisfy all of my obligations while still operating profitably?
There's an obligation to the employee as well, Kristin, because if the terms within the four corners of my contract don't also reflect the change, we could run ourselves into a bit of a problem. Is that part of the things when we talk about progressive planning that we ought to give consideration to?
Yes, of course. I think ultimately you have employees, and if you're hiring someone for the first time and you want to have these flexibility options, that should be incorporated into the contract. Additionally, when you have employees who, let's say, they've been working for a long time and you want to implement a policy with your business, then it's important to make sure that you have a very clear flexible work policy, either in your organizational policy or as a standalone one. And that will indicate whose choice it is. What are the circumstances in which there'll be a transition? If an employee wants to now adapt or adopt a flexible work arrangement, how do they communicate that and how does that transition take place? What things will be implemented? What expenses will be covered by the business? Those are things that employers have to now consider when they are making these transitions. And ultimately, it should all be documented very clearly so that everyone, employer and employee, everyone knows how it is expected to work, what everyone's obligations are, and what everyone's rights are.
And I'm glad you said that, because oftentimes that's the part we fall down on, documenting how it is to work. And Joan, back to you, because that is what's going to lead how we change our mindsets. If we better understand and appreciate what it is that we are seeking to achieve and the changes we're seeking to implement as well, then hopefully there's a greater buy-in, isn't there?
Absolutely. And, one of the primary shifts in mindset that we need is to move from a focus on constraints and limitation to possibility, right? Because we tend to have pre-existing structures and we see those structures as fixed, no flexibility, no room for adaptability, right? What this experience has taught us, or what it ought to have taught us, is that we can adjust form and structure in order to accomplish the function. And it requires us to take away the mental limitations that we've placed on ourselves simply because this is how it has always been. Prior to the pandemic, if you had said to, and let's use the public service because we all interface with it, so it's so obvious. So if someone in the public service had said before, we're going to explore remote working, people would have thought they were insane. But
Yes.
Look what happened. So when we take away those constraints, that limitation approach to how we do things, then the possibilities open up. So one thing that we now should recognize is that a one-size-fits-all approach is not the way we need to approach things. And so in terms of how we move forward with our work arrangements, we need to adopt flexibility. We need to be adaptable to the function and also to the specific circumstances of the individuals in question. Because some employees may opt, no, I perform best when I'm in the physical location. So that's what I want. While others may say, no, I'm super productive when I'm given the opportunity to work remotely. Another thing that we need to be able to look at, and this is really important for the people side of it, is that You know, in the old days, we used to say, oh, leave the personal stuff at the door, right?
Yes.
So there's a separation between your work life and the rest of your life. We now realize that that's an artificial construct that really doesn't hold up to the light of day. So as we move forward and we look at flexible work arrangements, we need to ensure that they are able to be aligned with the realities of the people's lives. So we're looking at work-life integration, where what you are required to do for work can be integrated in what you do with the rest of your life.
That is so very true. But I don't want people to walk away thinking flexibility means there's no accountability. That I can do what I want to do when I have to do it because, but hey, by the end of 24 hours, you would have had your contribution anyway. That's not what we're talking about here. We're still operating within certain parameters. And this is where, Kristin, I would like you to help us understand how do we build in those structures so that we achieve what we want to achieve. There is the elasticity that we're seeking to achieve, but there is still some control.
Ultimately, as I indicated, it's about the policy that you have. And in crafting that policy, you really have to discuss things with your team. That's the first thing. You discuss things with your team. You start to understand how people are most productive. And you also start to understand how people respond to certain restrictions. Ultimately, with a flexible work environment, there's several things that you can put in place to make sure that your employees are performing, but without being overly onerous. So, for example, you have timekeeping mechanisms. You also have very key performance indicators, and Joan, I'm certain, knows all about that. But the key performance indicators would really show you, is your employee doing what they're supposed to do within the time they're supposed to be doing it? And it's not a matter of being able to see them work. It's about being able to see the result. And once you document that and you work with your team, chances are they will understand levels of accountability. And let's also remember that just because, for example, if your flexible work environment or relationship is a remote one, as opposed to one which is just based on working special hours or compressed hours or anything of that nature, employees are still bound by principles of discipline. Employers can still discipline employees who work remotely. Employers can still make sure that employees know that they're not supposed to harass other members of the team virtually by use of any type of technology, cell phones, emails, WhatsApp messages, etc. And that same procedure that applies for employees when they're in office applies for those who work outside of it. So once people understand that there are consequences for actions, but also understand these are my expectations, then accountability is almost assured.
Joan, this is a discussion that has to continue because the changing work environment requires us to be able to do so. And the more we change, the more we need to stay on top of that change as well. But quickly, Joan, because sometimes you have to be able to find a way to empower an HR professional to have that discussion with the C-suite so that they understand that this is the way the business is evolving. What advice would you give to an HR professional this morning so that you empower them to be able to be bold enough to say, hey, boss, we got to talk about this?
Yeah. Thank you so much for that question. And one of the things that I always advocate is that as HR practitioners, we have evidence-based decision making. So when you're going to have that conversation with the folks in the C-suite, and we do encourage you to start those conversations, is that you have to go with your evidence to show that this works, that it's good for the organization. And there's research now, because we've been navigating this for over 2 years. So there's documented evidence that shows that there have been significant productivity gains under these flexible work arrangements. So educate yourselves, HR professionals. Look up the research, be able to have the conversation where you present the data to show what the gains have been. And the other thing, accounting is the language of business. So make sure that you can quantify as well as qualify the gains that your organization can expect by the effective implementation of more flexible work arrangements.
I'm smiling here because I so love listening to you, Joan. Honestly, you inspire me tremendously. Joan Underwood is the president of HRMAB. We've been talking HRMAB today. Kristin Turton is an attorney at law, but she's counseling all of you employers as well. Thanks to both of you. I wish both of you all the best for the holiday. This is our last interaction before the Christmas day. We start again in the new year. So Merry Christmas to both of you, and do have a Happy New Year as well. Thank you.
Merry
The
Christmas
same
as
to
well.
you and the entire team there at CBC.
Thank you so much, Joan and Kristin. Thank you indeed. I remember, folks, with HRMAB, membership brings benefit. You can go to the website hrmab.org.bb, HRMAB.org.bb, and become a member or an associate member, and you benefit from all of the association's benefits as well that will be bestowed upon you.
Morning, morning, morning. Good morning.